Five of the Best is an opinion-based series on films which I have seen released during the chosen year. This is to celebrate previous years in film, not to cause any offence. All opinions are my own. Hi everyone, welcome back to 5 of the Best, a series in which we celebrate movies year by year. This series will consist of me discussing my 5 favourite films from this chosen year. And in this video we'll be talking about the year 2018, so let's get started. Before we get into our top 5, here are the honourable mentions for this year. A Star is Born. Solo, a Star Wars story. Ready Player One. Tomb Raider. Searching. Black Klansman. Deadpool 2. And A Quiet Place. Now, let's get on to the list and start with number 5. Hereditary is directed by Ari Aster and stars Toni Collette, Alex Wolff and Millie Shapiro. Now, I should mention before I start talking about the fantastic quality that Hereditary has, I wanted to mention something that surprisingly I don't think I've mentioned really at all on the whole 5 of the Best series, which is the differing release dates. You know, you'll get those odd movies that come out in the US and maybe they come out in, say, November or December time of the year, late in the year, and then they come out there and then they get released a little bit later in the UK and all of Europe, say maybe February. So there is that kind of differing release date, and Hereditary is one that falls into that category, and there'll be a few others I would imagine that'll appear maybe on a year for me that I've seen it, but not for you guys, if you get what I mean. So say for example Hereditary you probably seen, if you did, in 2017, because for a majority of the places that received it, it only came out in the US until a few months later we finally got it. And by that time the hype had been built, but not to a crazy level, amazingly. Not to a point where it was like, oh my god, you have to see Hereditary, it's a brilliant film, it's a brilliant this, blah, blah, blah. I actually came in late to Hereditary. I didn't even get seeing it in cinemas when it was released here. I actually only got seeing it maybe about 6 months later, maybe mid-2018. And for that, I found a lot of things I really wanted in every horror film in Hereditary. And you know you get those horror films of certain generations that define certain generations. I mentioned this a little bit when I talked about Sinister a few years back, and also you can apply it to things like Insidious. And you talk about the horrors that define the 2010s in the same ways you have the horrors that define the noughties, the horrors that define the 90s and the 80s, etc, etc, and even now in the 20s. But for Hereditary in particular, this is the one for me that stands as the shining light. And not to say that the other ones aren't fantastic. You know, if you've been following the series, you know how much I wax lyrical about Sinister and how much I adore that film a few years back. But Hereditary in particular is the one that if someone said to me, and maybe said to you guys as well, what is a horror movie from the 2010s that what should I go and see? What should I watch? What should I take the time to actually really enjoy? What's the one that's likely to hit home the hardest? I think Hereditary is your answer. Because Hereditary is not... There's not an inch of this film that feels cheap. And I don't know if I've got too much into this on the channel, but I'll keep this kind of brief. But my biggest irritation with horror films in the modern media, and even through the 2010s and back from that, is the cheapness that they have. Get a very generic premise and just have a cheap jump scare every so often with a loud bang and loud noise. A cat jumps out from somewhere and that's your fright. But what I love, in the contrast to that and kind of the opposite of that, which is an earned scare. A scare that is worked hard to get you invested and then really terrifies you. And I found that with Hereditary on multiple occasions. And I think the biggest part of Hereditary is that it isn't one tone. It isn't just a certain angle. It's so many angles coming at once, but the overall feeling from Hereditary, the overall theme of the film is grief, and family grief in particular. And to activate something that I would imagine so many of us can relate to, and do it in such a heart-wrenching way, but also such a relatable way. Hereditary, I think, is so much more than just a horror film. It's just a fantastic movie. And that's not only down to the scares and the effectiveness of those scares and the effectiveness of the premise overall, but a lot of it's down to the direction with Ari Aster, who I think, in my opinion, this is still Ari Aster's best. Yes, there's been a good few others, and there's a few that maybe try to take that crown, but I found with Hereditary, this is just on another level for them. And let's talk about another level, because when you're talking about horror movie performances, I talked about this a little bit when I talked about Get Out, and also when I talked a little bit about It with Pennywise and things like that. But there is, and I mean, I will probably stand by this, unless I see something really amazing in the future, Toni Collette in Hereditary is the best horror movie performance I've ever seen. Simply put. She is unbelievable in this, in her conveyance of grief, her conveyance of emotion, her argumentative side, her emotional side, her connection with her family in the movie, is particularly with Alex Wolff, who also, I mean, I heard a lot of people say that he was overacting, or in some cases underacting. I don't think that's the case whatsoever. I think Alex Wolff is also fantastic in this movie, but I want to keep on Toni Collette just for now, because she is unbelievable in her performance in this. It's one of my favourite performances from an actress in recent memory, and it's still to, we're a good lot of years later, and it still sticks in my mind how good she is in Hereditary. I love so much of this movie. The scares, as I say, they're earned, but also they're really effective, and also, and this is something that not a lot of people talk about when it comes to horrors, but the memorability of a scare. Whenever you see a horror movie, something like, I mentioned it earlier, Insidious, there's one scare in particular that definitely sticks in your mind now. If you've seen it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I'm not even going to say it, because you know what I'm talking about. There's a few of them in this, and especially in Hereditary, it's not really a scare, it's something that happens that is so shocking and so harrowing that is kind of etched in my mind forever when it comes to horror media. Horror, again, I use that word, memorability. Hereditary is just, I mean, we could talk about everything else, but it's just one of my favourite horror films ever. It's 100% in my top 3 horror films of all time. It's so effective, it's so brilliantly told, it's brilliantly paced as well for a horror movie. The scares are all effective, there isn't anything cheap in it. Hereditary is just an amazing film. I love this, and I will always have Hereditary at such a high, no matter what horrors come out in the coming years, and I love them, I think Hereditary will always be somewhere thereabouts as my favourite horror films of all time, because of its effectiveness, because of its emotion and lack of in some scenes, the performances, and also even with Millie Shapiro as well, who also does so well in conveying that, what would you say, just the whole film is so harrowing, so harrowingly real. I think that's probably the 2 words I could give it, that it's probably the best description. It's just so haunting, it's so harrowing, but it's so effective, and that's exactly what a horror movie should be. Most horror films I go to see now, they have a totem pole to contend with, if you like, and Hereditary is definitely one of those ones that will always be there for me. Number 4. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is directed by Bob Persichetti and others, and stars Shameik Moore, Haley Steinfeld, and Mahershala Ali. Now, here we are, Into the Spider-Verse. I would say you're probably thinking this is too low for this. You're probably thinking, why is that not his number 1? Because it certainly is mine, if you're thinking like that. Listen, let's talk. Let's talk, and let's talk honestly. 2018 has some of my favourite films of all time, and Into the Spider-Verse is in that. It's It's up there with my favourite animated films of all time, bar none. It is definitely a top 3 for me when it comes to that regard, and everything about it is so fantastic. And the other films are more in personal preference, but everyone, and what I just talked about there with Hereditary, any of these films, this is probably one of the strongest year, and I've heard me say that a million times, but this really is. As far as the top 5 goes, every single entry could be a number 1, and I mean that. On any other year, they can all be a number 1, because Hereditary would be a number 1 on 9 out of 10 other ones, and certainly Into the Spider-Verse would be, because do I need to tell you how good Into the Spider-Verse is, really? If you haven't seen it, you've heard people talk about it, you've heard people wax lyrical about the fantastic visuals, performances, emotional moments, the whole spectacle. It's just simply one of the greatest superhero movies ever made. It really is. And for it to be an animated film, and for it to come out and to be released in that middle ground around the time of Infinity War and around the time of the MCU at its real climax, if you like, or it's certainly its defining era so far, to have it just be like a real shock, a real out of the blue brilliant film. You know, it came out in the middle of all that. You know, we had so many Marvel movies at this time, and some of them we've talked about already, and a real good time for Marvel and MCU in particular. But to have this released and to have not as much buzz about it because we're so busy focusing on everything else, I think that heightened the love for this movie. That heightened the, okay, well, I'll go see that. It's a different dish, if you like, but it's certainly along the same lines of what I'm loving so far with Spider-Man and the overall MCU. But what you get when you go to the cinema to see this movie is so much more. And I mean so much more. Into the Spider-Verse is what I just said there, a visual spectacle, emotional, the performances, some of the best voiced acting performances I can remember in recent memory. There is so much to love here, so much. And with the sequel and then the trilogy in the end, I mean, the quality is just undeniable as a whole, for sure. But with Into the Spider-Verse, it was probably one of the biggest shocks to me, and probably the same for you guys and anybody that really seen this movie. They went, okay, well, there's a good cast of voice actors here that were, you know, it's a good names. People like Mahershala Ali, who, I mean, this is a hell of a year for him, and we'll get there when we get there. But for him to be giving such a brilliant voice performances, and let's talk about Shameik Moore, who I don't know too much as a live action actor, but certainly as a voice actor, certainly as his voice as Miles Morales. He brings one of the most memorable, one of the most recognizable voice acting performances. I mean, you know what Miles' voice is like. If you've seen either this Into the Spider-Verse or, of course, Across the Spider-Verse in more recent times, if you've seen either of those, just me saying Shameik Moore as Miles Morales, you know what that voice is, you know that distinctive voice, and it's just so much. I just think when people talk about animated and growing up, probably like yourselves, watching things like cartoons, it's amazing to think someone a long time ago went, you know what, I'm going to apply the same care and love that are put into live action films and massive set piece movies, and apply that same love and care and devotion to the animated side of things. That was, and of course that was lots of years ago, but this is one of the finest in my opinion. And of course I'm maybe not the most versed in this genre, so I admit maybe I'm a bit ignorant in that regard, but Into the Spider-Verse is simply one of the most effective superhero movies, one of the most engaging. Yeah, definitely engaging. There is not a moment of this film when you're checked out. There's never a moment there's no slow pacing. The pacing is so brilliantly effective from the start to the finish. This movie flies in, but also isn't ever boring, you aren't ever on the edge of your seat, as cliche as that term is. There is always something on screen to have you engaged. And the addition of some of the different iterations of Spider-Man, different iterations of cartoon genres, animation genres, things like, of course, the Looney Tunes influentiation. That's definitely not a word, but I'm going to use it. But there's so much of Into the Spider-Verse to love. basically everything about it. This is undoubtedly one of the finest Spider-Man movies. It is definitely in the top 2 or 3. No, I wouldn't even push it at 3. It's definitely in the top 2 Spider-Man movies ever made. It is so effective, so amazing. I love it. Love it. And you do too. I mean, this is me. You know, I'm preaching to the congregation here because you know how good this movie is. You probably agree with me how good this movie is. And you're probably thinking, what is he doing only having this at number 4? And do you know what? I struggled. This one easily could have been number 1. So could Hereditary. So could any. And once we get to number 3, it could be number 1 too. This is where I'm at with this year. 2018 is such a strong year, and it's such a difficult year to have 5 and put them in some kind of order, because a lot of the genres are so different. A lot of them are such a differentiation of movie styles, movie storytelling, but also brilliantly effective. And Into the Spider-Verse is definitely one of the best. It's definitely one of the best animated movies ever. Definitely one of the best superhero movies ever. It's just one of the best movies of this time, full stop. Number 3. Bohemian Rhapsody is directed by Bryan Singer, ironically, and stars Rami Malek and Lucy Boynton. So again, what I talked about there with Spider-Verse and Hereditary, where do I put Bohemian Rhapsody? The Oscar-winning kind of staple of this movie year as a whole. It's maybe one of the most memorable for the general movie-going audiences. And Bohemian Rhapsody, of course, with Rami Malek winning the Oscar, and I feel deservedly so. Yes, there's a lot of quality this year, a lot of movies that maybe pushed him, but I think in as far as a leading man performance, and playing, of course, one of the most iconic leading men in history when it comes to music, which is Freddie Mercury, Bohemian Rhapsody is the best of the music biopics. Simple as that. There's been a lot of them, and of course there's more incoming, and it's a very flushed out subgenre nowadays. It isn't as much of a niche as it was around this time. Well, around this time we only really had this, maybe back to the Ray Charles movie in the mid-2000s, which I wasn't too big of a fan of. You had Straight Outta Compton, of course, which was more recently, and you had Bohemian Rhapsody. And Bohemian Rhapsody, for me, to this day, even though we've had a lot since, and a lot of great ones since, a lot of our Oscar performance ones since, Bohemian Rhapsody's still the best. And why is that? A lot of it's down to the performances, a lot of it's down to the story being told. But simply put, and I think this is probably the cheat code for these music biopics, the cheat code is simply how much you love the band, how much you love the music throughout the film. That's the reason that you're seeing this. If you aren't a Queen fan, which, I mean, I think everybody at some point or another has experienced the band Queen, probably loves one or two of their songs, or all their songs, or none of their songs. Music is like that. But with Bohemian Rhapsody in particular, I felt that it was probably still, it is definitely still the most effective of the music biopics that transcended to the movie-going audience, the general movie-going audience, the movie diehards, and just the odd person that would go to the cinema once a year. That's what I think is so great about a good movie like this. And for the people that only go to the cinema maybe once a year, and they decided, okay, well, I love Queen, I've loved Queen for years, I'll go just as this once, just as a change, a bit like they did with Elvis not that long ago, or movies like that, where they go maybe just once in a blue moon to go and see these movies, and when they do, they leave the cinema being really happy they did. And Bohemian Rhapsody absolutely achieves that. The music throughout it is brilliantly told, brilliantly woven into the story. The inclusion with real life events, of course, maybe an exaggeration on real life events, but also not straying away from the truth in a lot of it, of course, with how it was documented, of course. And Bohemian Rhapsody overall is just, it's definitely the one of the music biopics that I would rather go back and watch this than any other one. And yes, that's down to the Queen music. And that's what it's about. Because next year, for example, Rocket Man comes out with Taron Egerton playing Elton John. And his performance is great. Really good. But I don't love Elton John's music as much as I love Queen's music. And therefore, I don't love that movie as much. And that's kind of unfair, because it's also a great movie in itself. But overall, Bohemian Rhapsody really connects to me. It's you have that significance through music, and Queen has always been a band from a young age, even through my father. He always introduced me to music, and one of the most memorable ones, and the one that gives me the most nostalgia, is Queen. The band Queen, is the focus of this movie, that is one of the most iconic British rock bands of all time. And even through the direction of this movie with Bryan Singer, again, I joked there, to have a movie about essentially Freddie Mercury but the band Queen overall, and have it be directed by a guy called Singer. I mean, the jokes write themselves, don't they? But overall, I just think Bohemian Rhapsody is just wonderful. And it's not often I see, because you do get those films that are like Oscar bait, I've heard that terminology used, and I suppose it can be appropriate for a lot of movies. But I find with Bohemian Rhapsody, Rami Malek deserved this. And Rami Malek, before that, I watched a little bit of Mr. Robot, hadn't seen him in too much before that. For him to have this big step up, to take on this role of a lifetime, as you could probably describe it, and really pull it off to this degree, my hat's off to you, Rami. I just mixed his name together. Rami Malek. My hat's off to you, because you did absolutely brilliant. And the supporting performances in this movie are also fantastic. Of course, the other members of the band, people like Lucy Boynton in this movie as well, brings a lot of emotion, the scenes with her and Rami Malek as Freddie and Mary, and there's a lot of that. It's a lot more emotional than I thought it would be. Of course, yes, there is the dark ending, if you like, and the sad ending to the Queen story. But overall, this movie's just brilliant. It's just, when they said, you get that whenever you hear a movie's being made, and you could apply that to any genre or any kind of movie, and you go, this movie's being made. They're making a Queen movie, and it's kind of focused on Freddie Mercury. It's going to be a serious movie, but it includes all the music, and that's all the information you're given. And then you have this image in your head of what you want the movie to be like. Bohemian Rhapsody, the movie, is better than that, what I had in my head. And that was always what stuck with me. It always stuck with me about, if I can envision a film to be what I want it to be, and then it eclipses that, it overperforms that initial expectation, then that's as much as a movie fan that I can want. And Bohemian Rhapsody just did that for me. It was a shock to be so good, and for me to enjoy it as much as I did, because I thought it would be very studio-led. I thought it would be very dialed down and diluted, and maybe take away from the quality, not be as effective. Yes, it would have the music, but it wouldn't have as much of the emotion, and as much as the love and care and the craft and the learning about the real truth behind the band and their members and their stories and what they're like. But there clearly was the love and devotion, and that, I can't commend it highly enough. Bohemian Rhapsody is just, still to this day, I don't know that there will be too many in the future that could eclipse this for me as my favourite music biopic film, but I hope there is, because if it is, it'll be a hell of a movie, because Bohemian Rhapsody is just so good. Number 2. Avengers: Infinity War is directed by the Russo brothers and stars Robert Downey Jr., Chris Evans, and many, many others. Oh my goodness, what's he done? He's put Infinity War in second. He's put Infinity War above Spider-Verse. What's he doing? Has this guy lost the plot? No, I have not. I told you a minute ago that I adore every film on this list, and especially this top 5. Even the Honourable Mentions, which we'll get talking about. But Infinity War is Infinity War. And I know for some people they think, well, the MCU's kind of whatever. The MCU as a whole is kind of meh. Especially in the later times, and after this, it's not been able to recapture that magic. Sure, I agree for most of that. But Infinity War should not be as good as it is. Infinity War is the best MCU movie. And yes, we can talk about Endgame, and of course that's the second of the two, but Infinity War, to bring together all of these stories, to tie them all together, and put characters interacting with other characters you never really thought would happen, especially all those years ago when the first Iron Man came out, to think of where we were and where we got to with the Infinity Saga, and this is its conclusion with Infinity War, and of course the movies in between this and Endgame only built to that excitement of Endgame. But Infinity War, not only just that culmination, not only the combination of all the characters and them interacting with each other and the uniqueness and the brilliance of that and the chemistry that everyone has, and that kind of echoes back to the first Avengers movie, which had characters like Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, like Chris Evans as Captain America, like all of them. The fact that they all bounced off each other so well and had so much chemistry with each other, and that's really the thing that stands the first Avengers and those early films together, and in such quality, which is they shouldn't get on as well as they do. They shouldn't have that charisma and that ability to bounce off each other so well. So to get Infinity War, which is kind of like that dialed up to 11, that dialed up to a point where you have so many characters interacting with each other, so many different dynamics, so many stories that we've all been privy to and all been involved with watching for all these years. It was brilliant in that regard. But all that said, Infinity War is also the best told story. To have these many characters and everybody to get their chops, everybody gets their moment to shine in this movie. There isn't anybody who gets shorthanded in Infinity War. There isn't anybody that gets left to the side, disregarded, forgotten about. Everybody gets a moment to shine, and that's something to say, because there's not many films that are able to achieve that in any kind of regard, with larger casts and larger moments and these large ensemble casts. And this is probably the best example of it in any kind of media, which is an ensemble cast that all bounces off each other so well. Brilliant action scenes throughout this, the story, and introducing one of... I remember when we talked about, when people talked about this in the media, about Thanos and how they'll never do him justice because it's not like the comics. And I'm not a comic guy, you've heard me say that before. I'm not really into the comics. I'm only the movie side of things, so I don't know that. But when they said, oh, well, they certainly can't do Thanos justice, they never will. I think Thanos is a top 10 villain of all time after these movies. Certainly one of the most iconic. Josh Brolin brings so much to the role and brings so much... To have a giant purple man and for him to be as threatening and as believable, and I suppose that's the thing. There's so many moments in this film, and a lot of the Marvel movies, certainly things like the Guardians of the Galaxy are of course brought into this movie too, where it's a little bit surreal and they're playing on the madness, but what it never loses is its sense of reality. I mean, as real as it can be with superheroes flying about and everything, but there isn't a part of this movie that is silly. Yes, there's enjoyable jokes, and some of the jokes in this are very memorable, and it's a really funny movie as well. Some of the characters that you never really thought would interact. You of course have Chris Pratt as Star-Lord bouncing off Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, and that's a brilliant dynamic as well. You of course have Chadwick Boseman, who as Black Panther, who's in this and to a larger degree, and there's just some brilliant character moments throughout, and having that. But you know what this film does more than anything? And I'm not going to go into too much spoilers, but what I will say, the fact that it had the cojones to end the way it did, for what is essentially a family and kids movie, and a kids series, fair play. Because I did not... You always think that the heroes are gonna win, essentially. And of course they do, to an extent in most movies. But the dark tone that Infinity War leaves us on as the part 1 and part 2, and of course Endgame to come a year later, and kind of left us all a little bit in the dark with that. Fair play to the Russo brothers. You know, they made me a fan from this movie, and of course they had done things like Civil War and other ones before this, but this was really the one where I was like, okay, you have a lot of directing chops here. And between the two of them, to, again, I said this before, but given all these different characters their own moments to shine, it was really... And I suppose this is the overall point. Forget about everything else. When it comes to the kind of like the season finale, if you like, of the MCU, and of course it continued after this, but to come to essentially is the bookend of the, we started with Iron Man and we ended with Infinity War and Endgame. And for it to be as rewarding to the fans, because we've had lots of things. Even this year alone, this year of 2018, we had things like Game of Thrones, which ended. We had things like, what was that even called again? The Rise of Skywalker. I couldn't think of what the name was there. But we had things that didn't live up to the hype of the fandom that it deserved. But one thing that got it spot on and even more is Infinity War. And I think I've rewatched this film about 3 or 4 times now. Maybe more than that. And on every rewatch, it's so enjoyable. You remember how much and how invested you were as a fan through this time. And that's why I know a lot of people are a bit snidey about the MCU, and as I say, nowadays it's maybe a little bit more warranted because it's had a lot more, well, it's kind of had hits and misses over this period, whereas at this time it was a lot of hits and there wasn't too many misses in regards to this. And Infinity War was the shining light of them all. It's definitely the most rewatchable of all the MCU movies, I think, bar maybe the first Guardians of the Galaxy. Maybe. I really enjoyed everything they did in Infinity War. And again, it's a bit like what I talked about Bohemian Rhapsody there. When you're thinking in your head about, okay, they're doing this, they're bringing all the heroes together, and there's going to be the villain, and it's going to be this. In your mind, you think of, oh, well, it could be good, but I just don't know if they'll be able to live up to the hype. This eclipsed it. Infinity War was better than it had any right to be, and it continues to be. I mean, ask anybody what their favourite MCU movie is. I would say a good 80 to 90% of people would say that Infinity War is their favourite. And I agree with them. It's my favourite MCU movie, definitely. It's so enjoyable, it's so brilliant, it's so... it just does everything right. And it probably shouldn't, because there's so many moving parts and so many variables that could go wrong, and so many tick boxes to check, that they just did brilliant. They did brilliant with Infinity War. They encapsulated the world, whether it was youngsters, whether it was adults. Everybody was engaged in this story for a full year about how are we going to get from the end of Infinity War to Endgame. What is going to be the culmination of this story. And to do that, you have to be doing something right. And that's why it's definitely number 2. It was, again, all these movies are a lot of moving parts. But it's not my favourite movie of 2018. Because my favourite film is...
Number 1.
Green Book is directed by Peter Farrelly and stars Viggo Mortensen and Mahershala Ali. So, of all the films we'll discuss today, this is probably the only one you might not have seen, I would imagine. Because a lot of people seen Green Book and heard of Green Book through the Oscar campaign, and of course it won 3 Oscars, including Mahershala Ali winning Best Supporting Actor, although I don't think of him as a supporting role in this. I think of him as a co-lead. There's 2 co-leads in this, and that's Viggo Mortensen and Mahershala Ali, and then both of them. And it particularly, actually, in Mahershala Ali, you have, and I know I'm kind of butchering his name because I'm saying it fast and it doesn't really blend well with my accent, so apologies to Mr. Ali, but him in particular as Dr. Donald Shirley in this is one of my favourite performances, and actually Viggo Mortensen, I can apply that too, over the last 5 to 10 years. Okay, well, do you know what? This is an even better place to start. Green Book is one of my top 10 favourite films of all time. There we go. There's a good place to start. And why is that? Because I couldn't help but admire the craftsmanship of this movie. I couldn't help but admire everything and love everything about it. It's, of course, it's important message being told that I can never relate to myself, but also just everything about it is so delicately done, but so blended with a hard dose of reality in a lot of cases. But in someone like Mahershala Ali, who I've already talked about Into the Spider-Verse, and that's why I said he's had a great year, because what a year for him. As the Prowler in Spider-Verse, and as Dr. Donald Shirley in Green Book, that's as good a year and as good a 2 performances and as good a 2 movies to be in. To have Into the Spider-Verse and Green Book on your resume for 1 year, just 1 year of work, fair play to that guy. But the other one is Viggo Mortensen. Now, Viggo Mortensen is the true king in my eyes, the true king of Gondor. And he's one of my favourite people in the world. Certainly in the acting realm. Because watching all, and of course, if you've been on the series forever, you know that The Lord of the Rings is the be-all and end-all for me. But I had only really, bar something like The Road, I hadn't really seen too much of Viggo Mortensen as an actor. After Return of the King, really. And I mean, I was happy with that because his performance in Lord of the Rings as Aragorn is it's just amazing. I know I keep saying those words today, one of my favourite, but it is. This is such a year of favourites. This is such a year of things I just adore. 2018 is so good. It's so good. There's so much. But him as Tony in this movie is just the different dynamics of the two. And then we've talked over the time in 5 of the Best about great movie duos. Something that comes to mind is probably like something like Shaun of the Dead, where you've got Simon Pegg and Nick Frost, and you have the two of them, and they're one of the most iconic duos, certainly in comedy. In Green Book, with Viggo Mortensen and Mahershala Ali as Tony Lip and Dr. Donald Shirley, they're just two of my favourite characters, and their differences and the way they bounce off each other is just... Do you know, I knew I would struggle to talk about Green Book because I just don't know why I love it so much. That's the thing, and that's not because I can't define the details, but there's just something about Green Book that every time I rewatch it, I get such a flurry of emotion, such a flurry of love, and again, I use that word about the craft of cinema and the craft of this. And yes, I've heard people say this is a little bit Oscar bait, this is a little bit... I don't care. It deserved the Oscars. Everybody in this movie, even someone like Linda Cardinelli, who is in it for more of a smaller role, also brings... There is so much to love in Green Book. But I would admit, and I'm not high and mighty enough, or not too proud enough to say that this is maybe not everybody's cup of tea. This is maybe not everybody's kind of movie. You probably would enjoy maybe the other 4 I've talked about today, and maybe Green Book wouldn't even been in your top 5. But for me personally, I just love Green Book. I talked about this a few years back, where most people have their favourite of the year, but there's something that just eclipses it for me. That's what Green Book is. But I just love it. I just love it, and I know that probably sounds, well, why is he not going into details, or why is he not expand on the details? Because I can't, really. That's me being really honest. Green Book just brings me such emotion, it's one of those movies that really turned me into like a die-hard movie fan. And I don't mean like John McClane, I mean like an actual die-hard loving of the cinema as a whole and everything that goes into it, the craftsmanship, the storytelling. It was around 2018 when I really got into movies the way I am now. And with Green Book being kind of the defining of that, that's why it's such important to me. So yes, we could talk about performances, yes, we could talk about set pieces, cinematography, everything. And yes, all that's wonderful in this. Some memorable scenes. The opening scene in particular of this movie always sticks out in the bar. The bar/restaurant where Tony works, that always sticks in my mind. But really and truthfully, the reason I love Green Book the most is because it's one of the core reasons that I became a lover of film as a whole, and not just I enjoyed that movie. You know what I mean? You know when you get that, maybe you're not like this, maybe some of you are, where you get into film or TV or music or video games or anything, any type of media, but you get something that really warps your perspective for the better, where it's not just I thought it was pretty good, or I didn't like that, I liked that, or I didn't like that. That's what it starts as, but then it becomes, wow, I really enjoyed that because of this and this and this and this. And this was one of the first films I remember watching like that and going, I didn't just love this film because I enjoyed it. You know what I mean? It wasn't just at like a primal level. It wasn't just at like a base level of I enjoyed this film. It's now I love this film because it was able to bring out this kind of emotion with me and bring out this kind of invoke this passion for love of film. And that's why Green Book is always going to be one of my favourite movies for that. Yes, maybe that's because it's the figurehead and it's maybe the tip of the arrowhead, if you like, of movies around this time that got me so into film. Because prior to 2016, 17, 18, 19, I enjoyed movies, and of course if you've been following Five of the Best, you'll know how much I've loved movies. But a lot of them I've went back to. A lot of them I've went back and rewatched, and within maybe a new perspective, an older perspective, maybe a more mature way of looking at film than just that was funny or that was scary or that was whatever. Green Book is such a important movie for me, and yes, I get it's a very unique perspective to this, and I know that's not as relatable, and I apologise for that, because you're probably thinking, well, that's not the way I am with this movie, and you might watch this movie and you go, what's he talking about? It was good, but nothing more. Green Book really sticks in my mind as one of my favourite films ever, and it's for those reasons I've just gave there. I would implore you all to give it a go, though, because I just think everything about it is, to my mind, perfection. I don't think there's a beat that's off key here, if you like. I don't think there's a bit of this movie that wastes time. I think the pacing is fantastic. I think the performances are really what stands it so tall. The emotional moments, whether that be anger, whether that be disappointment, whether that be happiness, whether it's tears of anger or tears of love, everything that's conveyed in this film is just done so expertly, and that's why I love it. Along with those other reasons that it just stands, it has more. It's more than just a movie for me, and that's why I love Green Book. Again, you're probably thinking, why is he being so soppy about all this? It's just a movie, and you know what? Fair enough. If you go and see it, or you go and take the time to watch Green Book, and you go, okay, well, I enjoyed it, but I didn't love it. Fair enough. That's fair. This is just one of those ones for me. And we all have them. We all have these significant movies or pieces of media that stick in their mind. Whether it could be your favourite song, and it's not just a song to you, it's more than that. Green Book's a bit like that for me in the movie side of things. And that's why I adore it. And that's why it's definitely my favourite film of the year 2018. So that's been the wonderful year of 2018. I mean, you probably got that from when I started talking about Hereditary. The much I love this year of film. It's definitely one of my favourites. And then you're going to say, but you say that every year. You say that every episode. Why? You always say it's the best year. I don't. This is one of my favourites. It's one of the most significant to me because of the movies in it. And while we'll talk about the Honourable Mentions and what was close, but those top 5, I think, I haven't really looked ahead to 2019 and further, but I think the top 5 of 2018 is the strongest top 5 of all of 5 of the best. Because the fact that something like Hereditary, which I absolutely adore, along with all the other films, but the fact that I absolutely adore Hereditary and it's number 5 on this list is what makes it stand apart to this. Because Hereditary, you've heard me say where, number 2 could have been number 1 and number 3 could have been number 1 on maybe another year. This is the only year I can think where number 5, 4, 3, 2 and 1 all could be number 1s on any other year for me, bar maybe the odd scenario. And that's why 2018 is just so fantastic. But let's talk about the honourable mentions. Let's talk about some that were pretty close to breaking into that top 5. Were they anywhere near Hereditary? Not really, because I knew the top 5 and it wouldn't have changed. But there was a few that maybe on another year would certainly have got into the top 5. Start with the first one. And I talked a little bit there of Green Book when we were talking about Oscar season. Let's talk about The Star Is Born. A Star Is Born? Star Is Born. Whatever it is, whatever that first word is. Star Is Born with Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper. You might remember whenever I talked about La La Land a few years back, where my mum said, go and see this movie with me. And I went, no, I don't really want to, it's not really my thing. I did it again. I went, I don't know if I like Star Is Born. I don't think that... No, it's not really my thing. I like Lady Gaga. You know, she was good in American Horror Story because that was the only thing I had seen her in acting-wise at that point. And Bradley Cooper was kind of on his... certainly on the rise. Things like American Sniper had certainly made him into the serious actor off his comedy chops at the start with things like Hangover. But something like Stars Born, I say I got dragged along to. I didn't take much convincing, admittedly. But I went with my mum to see Stars Born, and I loved it. I think it's a beautiful movie. I think it's a brilliantly told movie. And it would definitely have made the top 5 if it wasn't a Strong of the Year. 100% it would have been. Another one like that, I'm talking about horror and sticking with horror. We're talking about Hereditary and being one of my favourite horrors of all time. One of my favourite horrors of this generation, and one of the more defining ones, is A Quiet Place. Quiet Place, directed of course by John Krasinski and having his wife Emily Blunt, and I really, really love A Quiet Place. But this is you'll maybe get what I mean when I say this. A Quiet Place is like Gravity from years ago. It was Sandra Bullock. Where in the cinema, it's one of the most fantastic cinematic experiences you can have. But watching it at home, it doesn't really hit the same. And the reason is because of the sound quality. You've of course got Millicent Simmons, who plays the deaf daughter in the movie, and of course living it a lot of through her and the silence. Quiet Place in the cinema is one of the most unique and brilliant movie experiences, and that passes through to part 2 of course as well, which came out, was it 2021 I want to say? Maybe 2020? And it was really, really, again, in another year it might have made the top 5. But another really good year for horror. Hereditary and A Quiet Place in the same year. That's something pretty special. And the last one I want to mention, from the Honourable Mentions, that was close, again, if it was another year it would have definitely been in there, is Deadpool 2. Because Deadpool 2, you know, when we talk about sequels, and sometimes sequels just really aren't able to recapture what the first one does, Deadpool 2 is infinitely better than the first Deadpool. And the first Deadpool I adore. So, Deadpool 2 brings in the dynamic of X-Force, it brings in additional characters, it brings in additional laughs, additional moments. What was more of like a starting point for the first Deadpool, everything was built on. The comedy is funnier, it's more of a hilarious movie in the second outing. Deadpool 2 is brilliant, and it was more of the same brilliance, but also increased in value. And that's why Deadpool 2 was also another close one. So they were the ones that were maybe in another year would have broke into the top 5. But in truth, nothing was ever touching this top 5. And for reference, I'm looking at my sheet now, which I have the list of the 5. I've scribbled out and changed Hereditary from 2nd to 4th to 5th. Spider-Verse was 2nd to 3rd. Bohemian Rhapsody was 5th to 3rd. Infinity War was 5th, and then went to 4, and then went to 2. But the only one that didn't change was Green Book, because I always knew it was my favourite film of this year because of all the stuff I said. And again, that maybe isn't as relatable, and I apologise because that's more of a unique story to me for that, but I still think there's so much value for you in watching it. But all 5 of these films, and do not, please, do not think because I put something like Into the Spider-Verse at 4 that I didn't like it. It is amazing. It is so good. And that was what worried me about doing this year, because I knew in myself, I was thinking, if I watched this video, I would go, so he loves it, but it's only number 4? It's only because there's such quality. And maybe you're thinking to yourself, well, Bohemian Rhapsody's not as good as Spider-Verse. It's just personal preference. It's personal preference and personal love of these certain movies. And just certain movies do certain things to certain people. And that's where I am. But you've heard me, that's why I wanted to explain that there, because I've changed this list so many times. That 2 to 5 have changed on multiple occasions, and this is where I left that. If I was to make this video in 2 weeks' time, or 2 months' time, it could be Infinity War could be 5th, Spider-Verse could be 2nd, Bohemian Rhapsody could be 5th. It was like that for this year. But just know, I said earlier that they're all kind of 9.5, 10. I actually think all 5 films are 10 out of 10s. You know, if I was doing initial thoughts on all these, they would all be 10 out of 10s. And that's how good 2018 is. I love this year. And a little bit of a spoiler, 2019's also amazing as well. So it'll be next year. If you want to stick around for that video, I'd love you so much. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like, let me know. As I say, subscribe and hit the bell for more like this. There's one of these every so often, and we're getting up to the present day. We're nearly there. We're nearly caught up. So if you want to stick around for that, I'd appreciate you so, so much. And if you do, I will hopefully see you in the next one. Bye, guys. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Before you go, here are some of my other videos. For updates and information on upcoming videos, the best place to find us is my Twitter. Much love, everyone.